My name is Emily, and at 29 years old, I never imagined my wedding day would be remembered for anything other than love. But instead of being celebrated as the bride, I became a shadow at my own reception. My sister stood in the spotlight, and my mother made sure everyone knew she was the true star. I can still see it as if it happened yesterday. I was standing in the center of the room, dressed in the gown I had chosen after months of searching. The flowers I had carried down the aisle were now resting on the table beside me, the music soft in the background, the laughter of guests blending with the clinking of glasses. I should have been glowing. I should have felt like the center of the universe. Instead, I was invisible. Because in one moment, with one announcement, my sister took the room from me, and my mother applauded her, saying she had saved the family name. That single phrase carved itself into my memory, and even now, years later, it echoes inside me. I was the bride, and yet I became an afterthought. What was supposed to be the most meaningful celebration of my life turned into the clearest reminder that in my family's eyes, I was never enough. Before I explain how that moment destroyed me and, in a way, remade me, let me pause for something important. If you've ever been through a moment where your worth was dismissed, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. It means more than you know, and it helps me share my voice with others who may need it. Also, comment below where you are watching from. I truly want to know your story too. When I think back on that night, what haunts me most isn't the announcement itself, but the way the room responded. Every head turned toward her, every cheer rose for her. I stood there frozen, my body present, but my spirit hollowing out. The applause was so loud, but inside, all I heard was silence. The irony was sharp. For years, I had been told in subtle ways that my role in the family was secondary. My sister was the golden one, the one who could do no wrong. I was the one who had to fight to be noticed, to be validated, to be seen. And yet, a part of me still believed, hoped, that just once, on my wedding day, I would be the one at the center. That illusion shattered in a single moment. I carried that weight in silence. My smile remained fixed because crying would have only fueled the whispers. My posture stayed tall because collapsing would have given them the ending they wanted. But inside, I was crumbling. I felt small, suffocated inside a dress that suddenly felt heavy, trapped in a room that was no longer mine. What no one in that room knew was that this wasn't just about the wedding. This was the culmination of years of being pushed aside, years of being told without words that I was second place. The comparisons had started long ago, woven into the fabric of my childhood. My sister was praised, while I was corrected. She was lifted up, while I was told to adjust, to be better, to try harder. So when my mother embraced her that night, declaring her the savior of our family name, it didn't come out of nowhere. It was simply the final confirmation of a truth I had been living with my entire life. But knowing that didn't make it hurt any less. That night, standing among the applause, I realized something quietly devastating. My family would never choose me, not even on my wedding day. And yet, as broken as I felt, that realization also sparked something else. It was the seed of a decision I didn't know I was making at the time. That moment of betrayal, as much as it shattered me, became the starting point of my own transformation. Because sometimes it takes being erased to learn how to write yourself back into your own story. Looking back now, I understand why it hit so hard. Weddings are supposed to be milestones, the moments we remember for the rest of our lives. And mine was memorable, but not for the reasons I had dreamed. Instead, it was memorable because it was the day I realized that approval from my family was never going to come. It was the day I stopped waiting for it. That night was a fracture, the breaking of something fragile I had been holding on to since childhood, the hope that one day I would be seen as enough. And though it took me years to understand it, that breaking was necessary. Because from that fracture, a new version of me began to form. This is the story of how my wedding day was stolen. But it is also the story of how I found the strength to rise from that humiliation, to rebuild myself without the validation I once thought I needed, and to finally claim a life that belonged only to me. And it all began with the night I was erased. I grew up in a quiet town in Pennsylvania, in a neighborhood where every house seemed to mirror the next, with tidy lawns and families who waved at each other as they drove by. From the outside, our family looked perfect too. We had a modest but comfortable home with a backyard big enough for summer barbecues and a swing set my father had built when I was little. But inside those walls, there was a constant reminder that love in our house was not distributed equally. From my earliest memories, my sister was always the center of my mother's attention. She was praised for every small thing she did, as though she carried some invisible crown that made her untouchable. I, on the other hand, was often told, without words, that I needed to try harder. My childhood became a series of comparisons, an unspoken contest that I never asked to enter but was forced to play. I remember birthdays, not for the gifts I received, but for the way my mother's excitement always seemed brighter for my sister's celebrations. Her cakes were taller, her parties louder, her pictures carefully displayed on the walls of our home. Mine existed too, but in smaller ways, tucked into the corners, less noticed, less celebrated. School only deepened the divide. My sister excelled in ways that matched my mother's ideals: good grades, a bright smile, a confidence that seemed effortless. I was quieter, more thoughtful, the kind of child who spent hours drawing or reading, content with solitude. But in my mother's eyes, my quietness was a flaw, while my sister's extroversion was proof of her brilliance. I learned quickly that to be loved in my family was to shine in a way that I did not naturally shine. Even small things became reminders. If I came home with a drawing, my mother would smile politely before turning to gush over something my sister had done. If I earned an award, it would be acknowledged briefly, then followed by a story about how my sister had already achieved something greater. It was not always harsh, not always loud, but it was constant, a steady current pulling me down while lifting her up. My father tried in his own quiet ways to balance it. He would take me outside on Saturday mornings, showing me how to plant flowers or fix the squeaky hinges on the back gate. He treated me as though my curiosity was valuable, as though my quieter ways mattered. But my father worked long hours, and my mother was the one who shaped the atmosphere of our home. And in that atmosphere, I was always the second choice. Holidays carried their own sting. On Christmas mornings, I remember watching my sister tear into her gifts, squealing with delight as my mother laughed and clapped along. My presents were there too, neatly wrapped, but the joy around mine always seemed subdued, as though my happiness was something less worth celebrating. On Thanksgiving, when relatives gathered around the long table, my sister was praised for how pretty she looked or how charming she had become. I was often overlooked, the quiet girl at the end of the table, smiling politely and pretending it didn't hurt. These moments shaped me. They taught me to work harder, to push myself to prove I deserved attention. But no matter what I did, the spotlight never shifted. My sister didn't just have the attention. She had the approval, the adoration, the affirmation that I longed for. The years of adolescence only sharpened the edges of the divide. When I was a teenager, the comparisons grew louder. My sister was described as beautiful, while I was different. She was admired for her social life, while I was told I spent too much time alone. She was encouraged to dream big, while I was reminded to be practical. These words were meant to guide me, but what I heard beneath them was always the same message: she is enough, and you are not. The truth is, I tried. I tried so hard. I joined clubs at school, pushed myself in classes, even changed the way I dressed, hoping that if I looked a little more like her, maybe my mother would notice me. But it never worked. My efforts were invisible, while her natural shine was celebrated again and again. It was during those years that I began to build walls around myself. If I could not earn her love, then I would learn to live without it. I poured myself into studying, into dreaming of a future far away from the comparisons that haunted me. I began to imagine a life where I could be seen for who I was, not for who I failed to be in my mother's eyes. But even as I dreamed, the ache of being overlooked stayed with me. Family gatherings became something I endured, Moments where I played the role of the quiet observer while my sister played the star. It was easier to stay silent, to smile politely, to pretend that I did not care. But deep down, I cared more than I wanted to admit. The imbalance was not just about love, it was about identity. When a child grows up in the shadow of another, she learns to define herself by what she is not. I was not the favorite. I was not the one who made my mother proud. I was not the savior of the family's reputation. These messages were etched into me long before I could understand their weight. Looking back now, I can see how those years shaped the woman I became. My need to prove myself, my hunger for recognition, my constant striving to be seen, all of it came from those early comparisons. And though I wanted to believe I could escape them, I carried that weight with me into adulthood, into my relationships, and eventually into my marriage. The truth is, my wedding day was not the beginning of my erasure. It was the final act of a story that had been written long before. My mother had always chosen my sister, and my sister had always taken what was handed to her without hesitation. That night, when she stood at my wedding and claimed the spotlight, it was simply the culmination of a pattern that had defined my life. But as painful as it was, it also forced me to confront something I had avoided for years. I could not change my mother. I could not compete with my sister. But I could decide, finally, whether I would keep living in their shadow or step into my own light. And though that choice would come later, the roots of it were here, in the quiet comparisons of my childhood, in the ache of always being second, in the silence of wanting to be chosen and never being chosen. That silence became the foundation of everything that followed. By the time I reached my 20s, the comparisons that had marked my childhood had carved deep lines inside me. I had grown used to silence, to watching my sister shine while I stood in the background. I had grown used to my mother's praise being directed elsewhere, to knowing that her words of pride were never meant for me. But even though I carried those wounds, I also carried hope. Somewhere deep down, I believed there might still be a place where I could feel chosen, where I could belong without competing. That place revealed itself in the form of love. I still remember the first time I felt truly seen. Not by my family, not by the people who had always measured me against my sister, but by someone who looked at me without comparison. He noticed me for who I was, not for who I failed to be. It was disarming at first, almost uncomfortable, to have someone pay attention to the parts of me that had always been overlooked. But slowly, it began to feel like home. Falling in love was not dramatic or cinematic. It was quiet, steady, and almost fragile in the beginning, as though it might break if I held it too tightly. I had grown so accustomed to being dismissed that I did not know how to receive affection without suspicion. When someone told me I was beautiful, I wondered if they meant it. When someone said I was enough, I waited for the moment they would change their mind. Years of being second choice had taught me not to trust praise. But over time, love began to soften those edges. For the first time in my life, I felt like I mattered. Not because of what I achieved, not because of how loudly I could shine, but simply because of who I was. It was a feeling I had never known in my mother's home, and it became addictive. The years that followed our first meeting were filled with small, ordinary moments that meant everything to me. Shared meals, long walks, evenings spent talking about the future. To someone else, these moments might have seemed simple, but to me, they were extraordinary. They were proof that I was not invisible. They were proof that someone could choose me, willingly, fully, without hesitation. When he proposed, I felt as though a chapter of my life had finally closed. For years, I had carried the weight of not being chosen, of being overlooked, of being compared and dismissed. But in that moment, standing in front of the person who wanted to build a life with me, I finally felt like I was enough. I thought I had escaped the shadow of my sister. I thought I had left behind the ache of my mother's favoritism. Planning the wedding became a project filled with both joy and tension. Joy because it was my chance to create a day that reflected me, not the comparisons I had grown up with. Tension because my family still hovered at the edges of everything I did. My mother criticized my choices, The colors, the flowers, the venue, always reminding me that my sister would have chosen differently. Every step forward came with a reminder of the shadow I had never truly escaped. Still, I pushed forward. I poured myself into the details, determined that this day would be mine. For once in my life, I wanted to stand at the center without apology. I wanted to be seen not as the daughter who failed to measure up, but as a woman who had built her own life, chosen her own love, and created her own happiness. But even in those months of planning, there were signs I should not have ignored. My sister lingered too close to the spotlight, making herself part of the story when it was not hers. My mother's criticisms grew sharper, her disappointment less disguised. At times it felt as though they were preparing for something I could not yet see. I brushed it off, telling myself that their behavior was just part of the pattern I had always known. I convinced myself that on the day of the wedding, it would be different. I told myself that even if my mother had never truly celebrated me before, she would at least respect this one moment. I told myself that even if my sister had always been the star, she would let me have my turn in the light. I told myself these things because I needed to believe them. Because if I didn't, I might have admitted that the people who should have loved me most were never going to let me shine. Looking back now, I see that hope for what it was: fragile, desperate, and doomed from the start. But at the time, it was all I had. Love had given me the courage to believe I could step out of the shadows. The wedding was supposed to be proof that I had finally claimed my own place, separate from my mother's judgment and my sister's dominance. And for a brief moment, as the day approached, I allowed myself to believe it was true. I allowed myself to imagine walking down the aisle, surrounded by friends and family, celebrated not as a comparison, but as myself. I allowed myself to dream of standing at the center of the room, loved, chosen, and finally free of the shadow that had followed me my entire life. But that dream was fragile. It was built on the hope that people who had spent decades pushing me aside would suddenly choose to let me be seen. It was built on the belief that love alone could protect me from the patterns of my past. The truth, which I could not yet face, was that the shadow of my family was not done with me. And the day I thought would prove my worth would instead become the clearest reminder that in their eyes, I had none. What I did not know then was that my wedding would not just test my love. It would expose the wounds I had carried since childhood. It would show me, in the cruelest way possible, that escaping the comparisons of my past would take more than a ring, more than a ceremony, more than hope. It would take breaking apart completely before I could learn to stand in my own light. The months leading up to my wedding were supposed to be filled with joy. I had imagined mornings of coffee while circling dates on calendars, afternoons of trying on dresses with laughter and excitement, evenings spent dreaming about the life that awaited me. I thought it would be a season of celebration, a time to finally step into the light I had long been denied. But instead, it became another reminder of how deeply the shadow of my family stretched. Every decision I made was met with criticism. When I chose the flowers, my mother frowned and said they lacked elegance, as though my taste could never be trusted. When I selected the venue, she reminded me of places my sister would have chosen instead. Even the dress that had made me feel beautiful in the mirror was dismissed as something that did not fit the family's image. It was as if my wedding was not truly mine, but rather another opportunity for them to measure me against my sister's imagined perfection. The weight of their disapproval seeped into every part of the process. I began to question myself constantly, second-guessing choices that had once made me feel confident. I would look at the colors I had picked and wonder if they were wrong. I would hold the invitations in my hands and imagine my mother's disdain before anyone had even opened them. Slowly, the joy of planning was replaced by anxiety, the excitement dulled by the constant echo of my family's judgment. What should have been the happiest time of my life turned into a quiet battle. On the outside, I smiled through bridal showers and fittings, but inside I felt myself unraveling. It was exhausting to defend myself in silence, to keep pushing forward with plans that were always under attack. I wanted so badly for this wedding to be a declaration of my independence, proof that I could create a life separate from the comparisons that had haunted me. But every step I took, they followed, reminding me that even here I was not free. My sister, of course, found ways to insert herself into the preparations. She made suggestions unasked for, her presence a constant reminder that in my mother's eyes, she would always be the standard. I noticed the way my mother's face lit up at her comments, how her approval flowed so freely toward her while my own efforts seemed invisible. It was as if my sister was rehearsing for a role she had not been cast in, and my mother applauded her performance louder than she ever acknowledged my own. The tension built quietly, layer upon layer, until it settled over me like a fog. I carried it with me into every store, every appointment, every late night spent scrolling through inspiration photos that never seemed to match the reality I was allowed to create. I told myself to focus on the love that had brought me here, to anchor myself in the joy of building a life with someone who truly saw me. But even in those moments, the whispers of doubt remained. Looking back now, I realize how much of myself I gave away during those months. I allowed their voices to live in my head, to dictate the way I felt about my own choices. I thought that if I could just get through the preparations, the wedding day itself would wash away the tension, leaving only beauty and love. I believed that the ceremony would finally be my moment, untouched by the poison that had followed me all my life. But deep down, a part of me knew better. The patterns of my family had always found a way to surface, no matter how hard I tried to escape them. The comparisons, the favoritism, the subtle reminders that I was never enough. They had shaped my entire life. Why would my wedding day be any different? Still, I clung to hope. Hope that love could be stronger than history. Hope that the day itself would rise above the criticisms and the interference. Hope that for once, I would be allowed to stand in the center without being overshadowed. What I did not realize then was that the preparations were not just difficult, they were a warning. The criticisms, the intrusions, the constant reminders that I was not their chosen one were all pieces of a larger pattern. They were setting the stage for something far greater, something I could not yet imagine. I thought I was planning a wedding. In reality, I was walking step by step toward the moment where my family would make sure that even my most important day would not belong to me. The night before my wedding should have been filled with joy. I had imagined a gathering of family and friends, laughter echoing through the room, warm smiles as we rehearsed the ceremony and shared one last meal before everything changed. It was supposed to be the calm before the storm, a night to steady myself and prepare for the biggest day of my life. But instead, it felt like standing on the edge of something I could not quite name, a quiet unease that grew heavier with every passing hour. The rehearsal dinner was held at a modest banquet hall not far from the venue. The tables were draped in simple linens, and the air smelled faintly of roasted chicken and garlic bread. On the surface, it looked like any other family gathering, people hugging, glasses clinking, chairs scraping against the floor. But beneath that surface was a current I could not ignore. From the moment I walked in, I felt the tension. The smiles were too rehearsed, the laughter a little too sharp. I caught glimpses of my mother leaning close to my sister, their heads bent together in whispers that stopped abruptly when I approached. Their eyes flicked toward me, then away, as though I had interrupted something I was not meant to see. It was subtle. So subtle that anyone else might have dismissed it as nerves or coincidence. But I knew better. I had spent my entire life reading between the lines of their actions, searching for meaning in the smallest gestures. And what I saw that night unsettled me. Throughout the evening, the whispers continued. My sister floated around the room with a glow that seemed almost inappropriate, as though she was carrying some private triumph. My mother followed her closely, her expression one of pride, her attention fixed on her in a way that left no room for me. I tried to focus on the details of the rehearsal, the order of the procession, the instructions from the coordinator, the reminders about timing. But I felt distracted, my mind circling back to those hushed conversations and the looks I was not meant to notice. Even during the dinner, when people gathered to eat and toast to the future, I could feel the distance. My relatives congratulated me with polite smiles, but their attention drifted toward my sister and my mother, as though they carried a secret that made them more interesting than the bride herself. I sat at the center table, but I did not feel central. I felt peripheral, as though the event was quietly shifting away from me without my consent. It was not just the whispers. It was the way my mother's hand lingered on my sister's arm, the way their eyes met with silent understanding. It was the way my sister's laughter rang louder than anyone else's, drawing attention to her as though she were the one being celebrated. I tried to dismiss it, to tell myself I was imagining things, that my nerves were playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew I wasn't. Something was being prepared, something that had nothing to do with me or my wedding. The unease settled into my chest like a stone. I smiled when people looked at me, laughed when they expected me to, but inside I was unraveling. My thoughts raced, searching for answers I could not find. I wondered if I was being paranoid, if my years of feeling overshadowed had made me overly sensitive. But every glance, every whisper, every shift in the room confirmed what my instincts already knew. There was a plan unfolding, and I was not part of it. As the evening wound down, I found myself retreating into silence. I listened to the conversations around me, but they felt distant, muffled, as though I were underwater. I watched my sister shine in a room that was supposed to belong to me, and I wondered what tomorrow would bring. Would my mother and sister truly let me have my day? Or was I foolish to believe that they could ever let me stand in the light without trying to take it for themselves? The ride home that night was quiet, but inside my mind was anything but. The unease had grown into dread, though I tried to smother it beneath hope. I told myself that tomorrow was different. Tomorrow was sacred. Tomorrow was the day I had dreamed of. The day that would mark the beginning of a new life. A life I had built with love and perseverance. I told myself that my mother would not dare to ruin it, that my sister would not need to steal a moment that wasn't hers. But the whispers haunted me. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I replayed them over and over in my mind. The glances, the laughter, the way the room seemed to tilt toward my sister. It all pressed down on me until sleep became impossible. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine walking down the aisle, the joy of seeing my future waiting for me, the warmth of being surrounded by people who loved me. But even in that dream, I felt the shadow of what I had witnessed. The truth is, I wanted to believe in the best. I wanted to believe that my family, even with all of their favoritism and flaws, would allow me this one day. I wanted to believe that love could rise above comparison, that celebration could exist without jealousy. I wanted to believe that I mattered enough to be left alone in the center of my own story. But somewhere deep down, in the quiet place where hope and fear collide, I already knew the truth. The whispers were not harmless. The glances were not meaningless. Something was waiting for me on the other side of that night. Something that would confirm what I had always known but had never wanted to face. I thought the rehearsal dinner was a warning. I just didn't yet understand how devastating the fulfillment of that warning would be. The morning of my wedding should have been filled with calm anticipation, the kind of nervous excitement that comes before a long-awaited dream finally unfolds. Instead, I woke with a knot in my stomach that no amount of deep breathing could untangle. The unease from the rehearsal dinner had followed me into my sleep, chasing me through restless dreams where I stood at the center of a room only to watch it tilt away from me again and again. The sun was soft that morning, casting pale light across the room where my dress hung waiting. For months, I had imagined what it would feel like to see it on this day, how it would shimmer with promise, how it would remind me of everything I had overcome to reach this moment. But when I looked at it, all I felt was the weight of expectation, the heavy silence of hope that could shatter in an instant. As the hours passed, the preparations began. Makeup brushes swept across my skin, hands adjusted curls into place. Fabric rustled as the gown was fastened. From the outside, I looked like every other bride, perfected, polished, glowing. But inside, I was hollow. The smile I offered to those around me felt rehearsed, forced, stretched across a heart that beat far too fast. I thought about the details I had so carefully chosen, the pale flowers that matched the season, the songs that would guide me down the aisle, the vows I had written in quiet moments when I still believed this day would be mine. They should have brought comfort. Instead, they only reminded me of how fragile joy could be in my family's presence. For every choice I had made, there had been criticism. For every piece of beauty I had envisioned, there had been doubt. Even now, as I prepared to walk into the most important day of my life, I carried the shadow of their disapproval. I tried to anchor myself in the love that had brought me here. I reminded myself that this day was not about my mother or my sister, but about the bond I had chosen, the future I was building. But the whispers from the night before would not let me go. They echoed inside me, reminders that in their eyes, I would never stand at the center, not even now. The venue was filled with the kind of beauty I had once dreamed about. Rows of chairs lined with delicate ribbons, candles flickering softly, sunlight streaming through tall windows. It should have felt like a sanctuary. But even as I took it in, I could feel the weight of eyes that would not see me, hearts that would not celebrate me. I had spent my whole life yearning for my mother's approval, and here I was, about to vow myself to someone who loved me unconditionally, still aching for the love I knew would never come. As the ceremony approached, time seemed to shift. Minutes stretched long and heavy, then vanished in a blur. My hands trembled, my breath shallow, as though my body knew before my mind did that something was waiting on the other side of this day. I kept telling myself to focus on the moment, to hold on to the joy that belonged to me. But joy felt slippery, fleeting, always at risk of being stolen. I noticed my mother that morning, her expression sharp, her attention divided. She did not look at me the way I had always hoped she would on this day. There was no pride, no softness, no recognition of the years I had carried the weight of being less. Instead, her gaze seemed elsewhere, tethered to my sister, as though I were merely a placeholder in an event that was already moving past me. My sister, too, radiated with a kind of energy that unsettled me. She smiled too easily, laughed too freely, carried herself as though she were the one about to step into a future worth celebrating. It should have been my moment, but even before the day had fully begun, it felt as though the spotlight had already shifted. The procession started, music filling the air, steps echoing on the floor. Each movement brought me closer to the moment I had envisioned countless times. And yet, with every step, the knot in my stomach grew tighter. I wanted to hold on to hope, to believe that once I stood at the altar, once I spoke my vows, the day would finally belong to me. But beneath that hope was fear, deep and sharp, whispering that my family had not finished with me yet. The ceremony itself blurred in my memory, fragments of light and sound stitched together by nerves. I remember the faces turned toward me, some smiling, some distracted. I remember the weight of the gown as it trailed behind me, the tremor in my hands as I held on to the moment with everything I had. I remember telling myself, over and over, that this was my day, that nothing could take it from me. But even as I said it to myself, I knew it was fragile. The reception hall was a vision of everything I had planned. Tables draped in soft colors, lights strung overhead, music filling the space with warmth. Guests laughed and mingled, glasses clinked in celebration, and for a brief moment, I let myself believe it was real. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to step into the joy I had fought so hard for. But then I saw them. My mother and my sister, their heads bent together again, their expressions filled with a secret pride I could not touch. The whispers had returned, louder now, carried not by sound, but by the way the room seemed to bend toward them. My heart sank. I knew then that whatever they had been preparing for had not yet revealed itself. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me, that it would happen here, in the space I had built for my own happiness. That night was meant to be the culmination of everything I had endured, proof that I could build a life beyond comparison. But as I looked at the two of them, as I felt the energy of the room tilt in their direction, I realized I was standing at the edge of something much darker. This was not just my wedding day. This was the beginning of my end. The reception had begun with the kind of joy I had once imagined, Music floated through the air, glasses clinked, and laughter rose from the tables as guests enjoyed the food and company. I moved from table to table, thanking friends and relatives for being there, smiling for pictures that would later look like fragments of happiness frozen in time. On the surface, everything seemed perfect, the kind of evening that should have belonged to me. But beneath it all, I carried the unease that had followed me for weeks. The whispers from the rehearsal dinner still echoed in my chest. My sister had hovered too close, my mother had looked too proud, and I knew something was waiting. I just didn't know what form it would take, or when it would arrive. I told myself to relax, to enjoy the moment, to trust that I was being paranoid. But deep down, I knew the truth. History had taught me that my family would never allow me to have the spotlight for long. The room was filled with light and sound, but for me, time seemed to move differently. Every moment stretched, as though I were waiting for something to shatter. My smile was wide, my posture strong, but my heart raced as though it knew what was coming. I wanted to savor the joy, to hold on to it with everything I had, but joy in my family's presence had always been fragile. Then it happened. It began with the sound of a glass being lifted, the faint clinking that called the room to attention. Heads turned, conversations stilled, and all eyes shifted. Not to me, the bride, but to my sister. She stood tall, radiant, with a glow that seemed to fill the room. For one fleeting second, I let myself hope she would speak words of celebration for me, but that hope vanished as quickly as it appeared. Her smile widened, her hand rested against her stomach, and in that moment, everything changed. The words themselves barely registered at first, drowned out by the roar of reaction that followed. The room erupted in gasps, cheers, applause. Chairs scraped back as people rushed to embrace her, hands reaching out in congratulations, voices rising in excitement. It was as if the entire evening had pivoted in an instant, the axis shifting away from me and toward her. And then came the blow that would stay with me forever. My mother. She stood, tears in her eyes, pride radiating from her face as she embraced my sister. Her voice rang out, filled with gratitude and adoration, proclaiming that my sister had saved the family name. The words sliced through me, sharper than any blade. Saved the family name. As though I had never been enough to carry it, as though my vows, my love, my very presence had been meaningless compared to this. The applause thundered around me, but I heard only silence inside. My body stood frozen, my face locked in a smile that felt like glass about to crack. I could feel my husband's hand squeeze mine, grounding me, but even that touch could not stop the hollow ache spreading through me. I had been erased. On the day meant to mark the beginning of my new life, I had been reduced to a shadow once more. Cast aside so my sister could stand at the center where my mother had always wanted her to be. The scene played out in slow motion. Guests crowded around her, their backs turned to me. Cameras flashed, capturing her moment in the spotlight while my dress, my flowers, my vows faded into the background. I could feel eyes glancing at me occasionally, some filled with pity, others with discomfort. But no one stopped the celebration. No one pulled the attention back to where it was supposed to be. It was as though the entire room had silently agreed that she was more important than me, even here, even now. Inside, I broke. The pain was not loud. It was quiet, crushing, suffocating. It was the weight of years of being second choice, condensed into one humiliating moment. It was the confirmation of every fear I had carried since childhood, that I would never be enough, not for my mother, not compared to my sister, not in the story my family wanted to tell about themselves. I kept standing, kept smiling, kept breathing, but every second felt like a betrayal of myself. My wedding dress, once a symbol of beauty and joy, now felt like a costume, heavy with the burden of pretense. My makeup blurred as tears threatened, though I forced them back, unwilling to let anyone see me break in public. I wanted to scream, to demand that this was my day, but the words lodged in my throat, silenced by years of conditioning. The evening continued around me. but I was no longer part of it. The music played, the lights shimmered, the guests laughed and danced, but I stood in the middle of it all, invisible. My sister glowed, my mother radiated pride, and I became an afterthought in the very story I had worked so hard to create. Later, when I replayed the night in my mind, I would wonder why no one had stepped in, why no one had shifted the attention back to me, the bride. But in that moment, the answer was clear. This was the pattern my family had always followed, and the world around us had simply fallen into step. That night was supposed to be the celebration of my love, the day I finally stepped into the center of my own life. Instead, it became the clearest reminder that in my mother's eyes, I never truly existed. And as much as it broke me, it also revealed a truth I could no longer ignore. If I wanted to be seen, if I wanted to live a life where I mattered, it would not come from my family. It would have to come from me. But in that moment, as the cheers echoed and my mother's words seared themselves into my memory, I was not strong. I was small, shattered, erased in a way I had never been before. My wedding day was no longer mine. It had been stolen. The applause from my sister's announcement still rang in my ears long after the room had settled back into movement. On the outside, the reception continued as though nothing unusual had happened. Guests laughed, the band played, the buffet line formed. But for me, the night had already split in two. There was the wedding I had dreamed of, fragile and fleeting, and then there was the reality I was forced to live in, one where I had been erased in front of everyone I knew. At first, I tried to convince myself the humiliation would pass, that the shock of the announcement would fade and the night would return to me. But it didn't. Everywhere I looked, the energy of the room bent toward my sister. Groups of relatives clustered around her, phones in hand, taking photos as she held her stomach with exaggerated pride. My mother stood at her side like a queen beside her heir, glowing with satisfaction, her eyes sweeping the room as though daring anyone to disapprove. I became a background figure at my own reception. Guests who had congratulated me hours earlier now barely glanced in my direction, their excitement consumed by the story that had stolen my night. I forced myself to keep moving, to continue smiling, to pretend that I was unaffected. But inside, I could feel the humiliation burning through me, each laugh and cheer for my sister deepening the wound. By the end of the evening, the damage was no longer confined to the walls of the reception hall. Phones had recorded her announcement, videos were shared, captions written, and by the time the night ended, my wedding was no longer just a private betrayal. It had become a public spectacle. The next morning, the evidence was everywhere. Photos of my sister's glowing announcement spread across social media, tagged by relatives and guests who could not resist the drama. The narrative was already being shaped without me. A family blessed with new beginnings. The happiest news revealed on a beautiful night. The words stung because they erased me entirely. The story of my wedding was no longer about vows or love or commitment. It was about her pregnancy, her triumph, her moment. I scrolled through the posts with a kind of numb detachment, watching as strangers commented their congratulations, oblivious to the cruelty that had unfolded beneath the surface. For them, it was a heartwarming story of family joy. For me, it was another theft, another moment where my life had been overshadowed by someone else's spotlight. But not everyone saw it that way. Quietly, messages began to arrive from those who had been present that night, people who had witnessed the shift in the room and felt the wrongness of it. A cousin wrote to say she had never seen anything so disrespectful. An old family friend admitted she had left early because she couldn't watch me being humiliated. My husband's family reached out with compassion, horrified that anyone could treat a bride that way on her wedding day. Their words brought little comfort, but they confirmed what I already knew. This was not just my pain. Others had seen it too. Still, the loudest voices were the ones who celebrated her. My mother's friends filled the comments with praise. Relatives shared stories of how proud they were, and in every photo, I was a blur in the background, smiling tightly as the spotlight shone elsewhere. The shame of it seeped into every corner of my life, Even in private, I could not escape the knowledge that my humiliation had been recorded, shared, and preserved for anyone to see. The fallout within the family was immediate. My mother, emboldened by the attention, made no attempt to hide her pride. She spoke of my sister's news as though it had been the true purpose of the night, as though my wedding had been little more than a backdrop for the announcement she believed mattered most. Relatives who might have comforted me instead aligned themselves with her, unwilling to challenge the narrative she was constructing. My pain was inconvenient, a disruption to the story of joy they wanted to tell. It was my husband's family who offered the strongest response. They confronted the whispers head-on, refusing to accept the way my mother had erased me. Their disappointment was palpable, their anger unfiltered, and for the first time I realized the fracture extended beyond me. This was no longer just about my family's treatment of me. It had become a conflict between two families, one outraged by betrayal, the other blind to it. The weeks that followed blurred together in a haze of exhaustion. Everywhere I went, the story followed me. At work, colleagues asked if I had seen the posts. At the grocery store, acquaintances congratulated me on becoming an aunt, as though that were the highlight of my life. Even strangers reached out, eager to share in what they believed was a joyful moment. Each time, I felt the same sharp sting of being erased. I wanted to retreat, to disappear until the noise quieted, but the scandal had a life of its own. The videos had been shared too widely, the posts too many times. What had happened at my wedding was no longer private, no longer contained. It had become part of my story, whether I liked it or not. At night, I lay awake replaying the moment again and again, the sound of applause echoing in my ears. I thought about the little girl I had once been, the one who had longed for her mother's approval, who had tried so hard to be chosen. And I thought about the woman I had become, standing in a wedding dress while the world applauded someone else. The grief was heavy, not just for the night that had been stolen from me, but for the years of silence and comparison that had led to it. The scandal might have been public, but the deepest wound remained private. It was the realization that I could no longer deny who my family truly was, or who I truly was to them. I was not the daughter who made them proud. I was not the one they celebrated. I was the backdrop, the afterthought, the shadow. And yet, in the quiet aftermath of that humiliation, a new clarity began to take shape. The fallout had exposed the truth in a way I could no longer ignore. If I wanted to reclaim my life, if I wanted to step out of the shadow, I would have to stop waiting for my family to see me. I would have to stop hoping they ever would. The scandal had broken me, but in breaking me, it had also stripped away the illusion I had carried for so long. This was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of something I had never dared to imagine, a life lived entirely on my own terms, without their approval, without their shadow, without their control. In the weeks after the scandal, I carried a heaviness inside me that words could not touch. I would wake each morning with the faintest hope that the sting might have lessened overnight. But the pain was there, waiting, sharp and unyielding. The world outside moved on quickly. New events filled the feeds, new stories claimed people's attention. But the silence within me only deepened. I was no longer simply a bride whose wedding had been overshadowed. I was a woman forced to reckon with years of invisibility that had culminated in a single devastating moment. Healing did not come in sudden bursts of clarity or waves of forgiveness. It arrived in fragments, small and almost unnoticeable at first. A night where I finally slept without replaying the announcement in my head. A morning where I stood before the mirror and saw more than just the reflection of someone forgotten. A walk outside where the air felt lighter, as though the world was still capable of beauty despite the weight pressing on me. These pieces of healing were fragile and often undone, but they were real, and I clung to them. I realized quickly that I could not heal while looking backward. For so long, I had defined myself by the pursuit of my mother's approval, by the endless comparisons to my sister, by the belief that one day I would be enough. But after the wedding, that illusion had shattered completely. My mother's applause for my sister's announcement had been the final confirmation that her love for me was conditional, if it existed at all. To keep searching for something that was never going to come would only prolong my pain. Instead, I began to shift my gaze toward the life I had built outside their shadows. My husband, steady and unwavering, had never faltered in his support. He had seen the same betrayal I had, and though he carried his own anger, he also offered me the gift of space to process my grief. In his quiet way, he reminded me that I was more than the daughter who had been overlooked, more than the sister who had been overshadowed. With him, I began to see the possibility of building something new, something untethered from the expectations of the family I could no longer trust. But healing was not linear. Some days, I found myself consumed by bitterness, scrolling through photos of my sister's growing pregnancy and feeling the wound reopen. Other days, I would imagine conversations that would never happen, my mother admitting she had been wrong, my sister apologizing for her selfishness. These fantasies were traps, pulling me back into the very cycle I was trying to escape. Each time I had to remind myself that waiting for their remorse was just another form of waiting for their approval, and that both paths led only to disappointment. Slowly, I learned to replace those thoughts with something different. I returned to routines that grounded me, simple acts that reminded me I had control over my own life. I cooked meals in our new home, filling the rooms with warmth and smells that felt like mine. I tended to small plants on the windowsill, watching them grow with the patience I had never been taught as a child. I began to write in a journal, pouring onto the page the words I could not say aloud, creating a record of my pain, but also of my resilience. There were moments, unexpected and unplanned, where healing revealed itself more clearly. One afternoon, as I walked through a park, I saw a bride and groom posing for photographs, the bride's dress billowing in the wind as the groom held her close. Instead of the ache I had expected, I felt a strange calm. Their joy did not diminish me, and for the first time, I understood that what had been stolen from me was not the essence of marriage itself, but only one night. My love, my commitment, my future, they remained untouched. Healing also came through the recognition that I was not alone. When I opened myself to it, I discovered that many others had lived their own versions of my story. Moments of betrayal by those meant to love them, celebrations turned to humiliations, families who chose favorites and left scars. Their stories did not erase mine, but they reminded me that pain was not unique to me, and that survival was possible. Each shared experience became a thread, weaving a fabric of resilience that I could wrap around myself when the nights felt too heavy. Perhaps the hardest part of healing was learning to let go of anger without excusing the cruelty. Forgiveness was not something I could give easily, and perhaps it was not something I would ever offer, but I could release myself from carrying the weight of their choices. I could refuse to let their shadows dictate the shape of my life. I could acknowledge the hurt, honor the wound, and still choose to walk forward without them. That decision did not erase the past, but it freed me from living inside it. As months passed, I noticed that the scandal no longer defined me in the eyes of others. The world had moved on, and while whispers still surfaced occasionally, they no longer carried the sting they once did. My wedding was not remembered for the theft that occurred, but for the love that endured. My marriage became the anchor I held onto, steadying me as I learned to build a new narrative around my life. The slow work of healing was not about grand gestures or sudden revelations. It was about reclaiming myself piece by piece, choosing every day to believe that I was worthy of joy, even if my family had never shown me that. It was about creating a home where I could be fully seen, not as an afterthought, but as a whole person. It was about embracing the truth that my value had never depended on their recognition in the first place. In time, the wedding became less of an open wound and more of a scar. Visible, yes, but no longer raw. It became part of my story, a reminder of what I had survived, and of the strength I had discovered in myself when everything was taken from me. Healing had not erased the pain, but it had transformed it into something I could carry without breaking. And as I stood in the quiet of my own life, surrounded by the pieces I had rebuilt with my own hands, I realized that perhaps healing was never about going back to who I had been before. It was about becoming someone new, someone who could stand in her own light, unafraid of shadows, unafraid of being unseen. Someone who no longer needed her mother's applause to know she was enough. When I look back now at everything that happened, I see not only the betrayal, the humiliation, and the grief, but also the rebirth of myself in ways I never could have imagined. What happened on my wedding day was a breaking point, but it was also the beginning of a deeper journey into understanding who I was and what kind of life I wanted to live. For years, I had carried the weight of seeking approval, of trying to mold myself into someone my family might finally value. That desperate search ended the moment I realized their vision of me had never been about love, but about control and comparison. The aftermath of the wedding left me hollow, but hollow spaces can be filled again. And slowly, with patience and perseverance, I began to fill mine. I no longer sought validation from people who had proven themselves unwilling to give it. Instead, I learned to build it within myself, brick by brick, through choices that reflected not what others expected, but what I truly wanted. My marriage became the cornerstone of this new foundation. My husband stood by me not because I was perfect, not because I was untouched by scars, but because he loved me in my entirety, flaws, wounds, and all. Together, we built a home not defined by appearances, but by peace. In our rooms, there was laughter, there was warmth, and there was a sense of belonging I had never felt in my mother's house. I learned that family is not always the one you are born into, but sometimes the one you create through love, trust, and shared resilience. There were still shadows, of course. My sister's pregnancy advanced, and with it came more celebrations, more attention, more reminders of what I had lost. But those reminders no longer crushed me the way they once had. I realized that her choices, her life, and even my mother's blindness toward me did not diminish the worth of my own. I did not need to compete for a spotlight that had never been meant for me. Instead, I chose to step into a different kind of light, the quiet, steady glow of living authentically. The lessons of my journey were not learned overnight. They came through sleepless nights, through tears that I thought would never stop, through long walks where I asked myself questions with no answers. But little by little, those questions shaped me. They asked me who I wanted to be without the weight of expectation. They asked me what kind of woman I could become if I no longer measured myself against others. They asked me if I was ready to live a life that was mine alone. And in time, my answer was yes. Forgiveness was never the center of my healing. I did not need to forgive my mother or my sister in order to move forward. What I needed was to release myself from the grip of their choices. Anger, when carried too long, becomes another chain, and I chose to set it down. Not for them, but for me. By letting go, I created room inside myself for peace, for joy, and for the possibility of a future not dictated by the shadows of the past. I began to focus on small acts that restored my spirit. Planting flowers in my backyard, reminding myself that growth often comes after seasons of darkness. Cooking meals that nourished not only the body, but the soul. Writing down memories, both painful and beautiful, so that they would not fester unspoken inside me. Each act was an affirmation that my life was my own to shape. I also came to understand that scars are not signs of weakness. They are proof of survival. Every time I looked at the memory of my wedding day, I felt a pang of sadness. Yes, but also a surge of strength. I had lived through it, endured the sting of betrayal, and still chosen to stand. That choice mattered more than anything else. Because life is not measured by what breaks us, but by what we build after we have been broken. In time, the wound became less about what was taken from me and more about what I reclaimed. I reclaimed my voice, no longer silenced by the fear of disapproval. I reclaimed my joy, no longer overshadowed by the applause given to someone else. And most importantly, I reclaimed my worth, no longer defined by whether my mother could see it. As I share my story with you now, I hope it serves as a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is a path forward. Betrayal can cut deep, but it cannot erase who you are. Humiliation can bruise, but it cannot take away your ability to rise. The love you deserve may not come from where you once expected it, but it can be found, often in the places you least anticipate. If you are listening to this and carrying your own burden of pain, know that your story is not over. The chapter you are in right now is not the final one. There are still pages left unwritten, and within them lies the possibility of healing, of love, of joy you may not yet see. Hold on, because your strength is greater than you realize. And if my story touched you today, I ask you to take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Share where you are watching from in the comments. I would love to know your story too. Hit that like button if you believe in second chances, in healing, and in the power of resilience. I wish you a beautiful day filled with peace, strength, and hope. Remember that no matter what has been taken from you, no matter what you have endured, your light still shines. You are more than your scars. You are the author of your next chapter. Have a wonderful day, and amen.